the true state of American military power here in 2025. And you just have to start with the sheer scale of the money involved. We're talking about a defense budget nudging up against, what, $1 trillion for fiscal year 2025. It's a number so vast it almost loses meaning. But why does that staggering figure matter beyond just, how much cash is being thrown around?
Well, yeah, what's fascinating here is that the money is the foundation. It's the brute force, the engine that enables the U.S. to even contend for its position. It's the necessary, though, far from sufficient, condition for maintaining what is still, by any measure of raw military capability, the world's sole superpower. But like you said, the landscape has utterly transformed. That unipolar moment, the post-Cold War period,
Yes.
where the U.S. operated without a peer rival, that's ancient history now. We are firmly entrenched in a multipolar world, one that is deeply contested, tense as hell, and frankly, far more dangerous. That colossal spending is less about unchecked dominance now and more about the increasingly difficult struggle to, navigate this shifting reality.
Exactly. This deep dive is pulled from a stack of analysis that really cuts through the noise, looking at the data, the trends, the strategic thinking. It paints a picture of a force that is undeniably dominant in certain ways, boasts unparalleled technological prowess, but is also facing some absolutely brutal vulnerabilities. It's an intense strategic chess match playing out globally, and our mission here is to give you, the listener, the clearest possible understanding of America's strengths, its genuinely alarming weaknesses, and the profound implications for the world we all inhabit. This isn't some dry lecture. It's about grasping the strategic stakes in real terms.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the strategic rules are fundamentally different now. Rivals aren't necessarily aiming to go toe-to-toe across the board. They're looking for asymmetric advantages, pressure points, ways to bypass or negate core U.S. strengths. The budget allows the U.S. to play the game on a global scale, but it doesn't guarantee a win anymore. It buys potential, but not certainty.
So let's get down to that raw quantitative picture. Because the numbers, they really tell a story, especially when you compare them directly.
They are genuinely staggering, yeah. Laying bare the financial dominance is essential. Based on the 2024 figures, the U.S. military expenditure hit an eye-watering $997 billion.
Wow. Almost $1 trillion.
Almost. And to give that context, that figure alone represents somewhere between 37% and 40% of total global military expenditure.
40% for one country.
One country spending almost half of what the entire planet spends on defense.
Yeah. That figure is hard to even get your head around. And the comparison to the next tier is just, it's events. China is estimated to be around $314 billion, and that's likely a conservative estimate, by the way, while Russia clocks in at roughly $149 billion.
Which means the U.S. is spending over 3 times what China does, and more than 6 times what Russia does, just on the top line. And the sources point out that the top 5 nations, the U.S., China, Russia, Germany, and India, collectively account for 60% of that record-breaking global total of $2.718 trillion in 2024.
60% in just 5 countries.
It's a damn clear indicator of the heightened geopolitical temperature worldwide. Yeah.
Okay, so nearly $1 trillion. What does that gargantuan sum actually buy for the U.S. military in the proposed FY 2025 budget? It's still huge, even with potential caps, looking at $849.8 billion.
Well, that money is sliced across every function imaginable. A significant chunk, $143.2 billion, goes into research, development, test, and evaluation, RDT&E. That's the engine funding the future of warfare.
The future tech.
Exactly. Another colossal slice, $167.5 billion, is for procurement, which is the actual buying of the next generation of ships, planes, ground systems, weaponry.
For hardware. Lots of hardware.
Lots of hardware. And keeping the current force ready, trained, and equipped accounts for $147.5 billion in readiness funding.
And then there's the foundational stuff. Nuclear deterrence isn't cheap or static, right?
Not at all. $49.2 billion is earmarked specifically for modernizing the nuclear triad. That means funding the new Sentinel intercontinental ballistic missiles, the Columbia-class submarines that carry ballistic missiles, and the B-21 Raider stealth bomber.
The big 3.
This is a serious multi-decade investment in the ultimate deterrent, getting a major facelift.
And beyond the nuclear side.
Beyond that, substantial funds flow into specific platforms. Air Force programs get $61.2 billion, and naval assets receive $48.1 billion. And sustaining that global presence isn't free. The Pacific Deterrence Initiative is slated for $9.9 billion, and the European Deterrence Initiative gets $2.9 billion.
That's the cost of the footprint.
That's the cost of maintaining a worldwide footprint, of being forward deployed.
Yeah. This kind of financial muscle gives the U.S. a strategic flexibility that its competitors simply can't match. I mean, that seems obvious.
Exactly. Look at Russia. They're spending a staggering 7.1% of their GDP on defense, a massive national effort. But their economy is under severe strain from the Ukraine conflict and sanctions. They are forced to make painful choices, heavily prioritizing immediate production of tanks and shells for the grinding war over long-term, high-risk R&D or modernization of strategic platforms not directly engaged.
They're focused on now.
Right. And China's budget, while massive and growing consistently for decades, has to support the world's largest standing army and a naval expansion program of unprecedented scale. They're building ships at a, frankly, terrifying pace.
So while both China and Russia have huge defense budgets, their needs force harder trade-offs. The U.S., with its nearly $1 trillion, can afford to pursue multiple complex priorities, simultaneously bleeding-edge R&D, massive procurement, global presence, and nuclear modernization.
That financial bedrock isn't just about buying gear, it's a fundamental strategic tool. It enables technological superiority on a scale that others struggle to replicate, and it underpins the ability to project power globally in ways no other nation can.
But then you look at something like the Global Firepower Index. It's widely cited a conventional benchmark, right? And it ranks the U.S. #1, sure, with a score of 0.0744. But then China and Russia are right on its heels, practically tied at 0.0788. On the surface, that suggests a much closer contest than that massive budget gap would imply. What's going on there?
This is precisely where the numbers start to mask a more complex reality, and frankly, this is where it gets really interesting. The GFP index aggregates over 60 factors, giving you a snapshot of raw potential. It counts ships, planes, tanks, personnel. And by those raw counts, China and Russia do bring immense mass to the table.
You see it in the specifics they list. The U.S. does have a commanding lead in total aircraft. 13,043 compared to China's 3,309 and Russia's 4,292. And those 11 nuclear-powered supercarriers the U.S. has versus China's 3 and Russia's 1. Carriers are the absolute backbone of global power projection. Nobody else is even in the same zip code there.
Right. But then the index highlights China's scale. The world's largest navy by the sheer number of hulls at 754 total, even if many are smaller coastal vessels, alongside the largest active-duty army. Russia, leveraging its Soviet legacy and recent production push, still fields more main battle tanks on paper, 5,750 compared to the U.S.'s 4,640.
So the paradox is that the GFP index, by focusing on quantity and treating platforms somewhat generically in aircraft, is just an aircraft misses the qualitative leap. It doesn't truly capture the difference between, say, a fifth-generation stealth fighter like the F-35 and older legacy aircraft, or the difference in crew training and maintenance.
Precisely. The index, in its raw tabulation, obscures the profound qualitative advantages the U.S. has spent decades building. It doesn't fully account for things like the superior training standards of personnel, the unmatched logistical capability to move and sustain forces anywhere on Earth. The decades of effort building true joint integration, getting the Navy, Air Force, Army, Marines, and Space Force to operate seamlessly together, and, frankly, the hard-won, high-end combat experience gained over decades of actual operations.
Right, actual fighting.
These are areas where the U.S. has a decisive edge that is damn difficult for rivals to replicate quickly, regardless of how many platforms they build.
So that narrow GFP score gap suggests a much closer conventional fight than the reality of combat effectiveness might bear out. The numbers show China and Russia can muster immense mass, which is critical in a potential war of attrition, but the U.S. lead is rooted in deeper, more complex factors than just headcount or hull count.
It is. But that brings us squarely to perhaps the most brutal, concerning challenge highlighted in the analysis: the industrial-based dilemma, the ability to produce the tools of war and do it fast.
Yeah, this feels like the Achilles heel, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The U.S. defense industrial base is a marvel of engineering and complexity, optimized over decades for peacetime efficiency. It can build exquisite, highly advanced platforms, but it does so incredibly slowly and expensively. It's built for quality, not for speed or scale.
And that is in goddamn stark contrast to Russia and China. They are explicitly, fundamentally retooling their economies and their industries for high-tempo, large-scale conflict. They are building their bases for attrition, for a protracted slugfest. And that creates a fundamental strategic mismatch with the U.S. approach.
The war in Ukraine has been a brutal, undeniable catalyst for Russia on this front. Their economy has shifted onto a war footing. They're not just relying on old stockpiles. They're reopening production lines, converting civilian factories.
And the numbers coming out are, frankly, alarming. Estimates suggest Russia can now produce around 1,500 new tanks and 3,000 armored vehicles per year.
1,500 tanks a year.
Compare that to the U.S., which is currently building just 135 new Abrams tanks annually and effectively 0 new Bradley fighting vehicles.
Wow.
The sheer volume disparity in core ground combat platforms is stunning.
But the number that truly hits you in the gut is artillery shells.
Yeah.
This is a war defined by artillery barrages.
Yeah. U.S. European Command estimates Russia is producing 250,000 artillery shells per month.
Per month.
Per month. That production rate puts them on track to build a stockpile 3 times larger than the U.S. and Europe combined. Let that sink in.
3 times. Yeah, exactly.
3 times the total stockpile capacity. And China's shipbuilding capacity is another goddamn terrifying example. The analysis states China's shipyard capacity is a mind-boggling 200 times that of the United States.
200 times. How is that even possible?
They can churn out more warships in a month than the U.S. can build in an entire year. Their state-directed dual-use industrial system is explicitly designed to pivot to wartime construction and repair on a scale the U.S. simply cannot replicate today.
And this isn't some abstract future problem. This has real immediate consequences for the U.S. military. Senior leaders are constantly highlighting dwindling stockpiles, particularly of precision-guided munitions and advanced missiles. We're seeing it play out right now in operations like the Red Sea, where continuous intercepts are consuming expensive munitions that the U.S. has described brittle industrial base can't replace anywhere near the rate they're being used.
This is the central strategic dilemma. The U.S. strategy for decades has relied on winning quickly and decisively using technological overmatch and professional excellence. But if the next major conflict, particularly with a peer adversary, devolves into a grinding war of attrition which is made terrifyingly possible by the sheer scale of rival industrial capacity, the U.S. could find itself overwhelmed by sheer mass as it struggles desperately to resupply, replace losses, and generate new capabilities at a pace that matches the conflict. This is the brutal reality defense planners are grappling with. The question is whether the industrial base can keep up with the warfighting concept.
That leads us perfectly into the technological frontier, because that's where the U.S. is supposed to hold its decisive edge. But as you just pointed out, even here, rivals are finding ways to challenge that.
Absolutely. The U.S. still leads in the development and deployment of advanced conventional and nuclear platforms, and that's a direct payoff from that massive R&D investment we talked about earlier.
Right. The nuclear triad modernization alone is a huge commitment. $9.9 billion for the new Columbia-class subs. These are the absolute cornerstone of the triad, operating stealthily for decades.
Yep.
$5.3 billion for the B-21 Raider bomber, which is integrating cutting-edge stealth and standoff capabilities. And $3.7 billion for the Sentinel ICBMs, replacing the aging Minuteman III.
These are foundational programs intended to ensure strategic deterrence far into the future. Can't neglect those.
And conventionally.
And in conventional air power, the U.S. fleet of F-22s and F-35s, the 5th-generation stealth fighters, remains the most capable Air Force ever assembled. Full stop. And they are already pouring money into the next-generation air dominance NGAD program for 6th-generation concepts, still pushing the envelope.
But then you hit hypersonics, and here's where it gets really challenging, and frankly, where the U.S. is playing catch-up. Both Russia and China have prioritized these systems, and they are damn explicitly designed to neutralize core U.S. advantages, particularly our forward-deployed forces.
China's progress here is particularly concerning. They've already operationally deployed systems like the DF-17. This is a road mobile missile that launches a hypersonic glide vehicle, or HTV. Think of an HTV as a warhead that detaches and glides through the atmosphere at incredible speeds, maneuvering unpredictably.
Glides and maneuvers.
Yeah. The DF-17 flies at Mach 5 to 10, covering ranges up to 2,500 kilometers. Then they have the newer DF-27 with an even longer reach, nearly 8,000 kilometers.
So these aren't just fast. They're fast, and they can change direction mid-flight, making them incredibly difficult for existing missile defense systems, which are designed to intercept predictable ballistic trajectories, to track and intercept.
Precisely. You got it. And China is pushing further, developing technologies like the Starry Sky 2 Wave Rider vehicle, which uses shockwaves from its own flight to increase lift, making it even harder to track and adding to its range and maneuverability.
Russia, meanwhile, has actually used these kinds of weapons in combat in Ukraine, which is a chilling real-world test case.
Yes, they have employed the KH-47M2 Kinzhal, an air-launched ballistic missile that reaches Mach 10, and the 3M22 Zircon, which can be launched from ships or land and hits Mach 9. They use them because these weapons are designed specifically to penetrate sophisticated Western air defenses like the Patriot system, leveraging sheer speed and their ability to perform evasive maneuvers in the terminal phase.
This brings us to a damn critical point about asymmetric warfare. Instead of trying to match the U.S. by building multi-trillion-dollar supercarrier battle groups, adversaries are developing weapons that can put those incredibly expensive assets at catastrophic risk for a tiny fraction of the cost.
Exactly. These carrier-killer hypersonic missiles create anti-accessory denial, or A2AB bubbles. They can potentially force U.S. carriers to operate thousands of kilometers away from a conflict zone,
Which kills their effectiveness.
dramatically reducing the range and effectiveness of their aircraft, or risk catastrophic loss from an uninterceptable attack. It's a textbook asymmetric strategy aimed directly at neutering the U.S.'s primary tool for projecting power globally.
Okay, so while rivals challenge in specific areas, the sources also argue that the true, deep American technological advantage isn't necessarily one specific weapon, but the system of innovation itself. And DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, is held up as the absolute epitome of that.
This is profoundly important and exceptionally difficult for state-controlled systems like those in China or Russia to genuinely replicate. While they can direct vast resources, they struggle with the agility, the risk tolerance, and the bottom-up creativity of the U.S. innovation ecosystem, which DARPA embodies. That $143.2 billion FY25 R&D request, that's more than most countries spend on their entire defense budgets.
And that colossal sum is funding everything from foundational science, $17 2Bs, to cutting-edge AI, $1 and 8B, and the complex vision of JADC2, $1 4B.
JADC2, or Joint All-Domain Command and Control. That's the vision of linking every sensor, every shooter, every command node across land, sea, air, space, and cyber in real time, powered by AI and data.
Faster decisions.
It's about shrinking the decision timeline from minutes or hours to seconds. DARPA, created back in 1958 specifically to prevent strategic surprise for the U.S. and create technological surprise for adversaries, is built for this high-risk, high-reward work. Its model of bringing in brilliant program managers for short stints from academia and industry is designed to foster breakthroughs.
And their track record is legendary: the internet, GPS, stealth technology, things that fundamentally change the world, emerging from DARPA programs.
And recent programs show this engine is still firing on all cylinders, producing results that sound almost like science fiction. Take the Air Combat Evolution Program, ACE. In 2023, an AI agent developed under this program actually dogfought a human F-16 pilot.
Wait, what? A real dogfight?
Not a simulation. It was in a real modified F-16 test aircraft, the X-62A. That's proving the potential for AI-human collaborative dogfighting in the damn cockpit.
That is truly wild. An AI flying a real jet in a dogfight against a human. What else is coming out of DARPA that's hitting that level of mind-bending?
Well, the AI Cyber Challenge, AICC, is revolutionizing cybersecurity speed. They had AI systems competing to find and patch vulnerabilities in complex, widely used open-source software, think the Linux kernel, or Sequel 3, which is in billions of devices. These AI systems were finding and proposing fixes for vulnerabilities in minutes, not the months or years it often takes human teams.
Minutes, not months.
Minutes. One system even discovered a previously unknown zero-day bug in Sequel 3 during the competition. That fundamentally changes the speed of cyber defense and offense.
Finding and fixing bugs in minutes, that's an exponential leap.
Absolutely. And then there's the High Assurance Cyber Military Systems Program, HACMS. This effort developed mathematically unhackable software for military critical systems. They put this software on a drone helicopter and gave multiple teams of expert hackers full access, full control, told them to break in.
Yeah.
The hackers completely failed. That code still hasn't been hacked.
Mathematically unhackable. That's a hell of a claim, backed up by testing.
It is. And DARPA has numerous foundational programs in cyber warfare, like Plan X, which was about developing cyber war planning tools. RADX focused on how to rapidly restore the power grid after a massive cyber attack, or Chase, aimed at hunting threats at machine speed.
So this innovation ecosystem, spearheaded by DARPA, is the strategic moat. Even if a rival achieves a temporary lead in a specific technology, the U.S. is likely already funding the research to create the next generation of tech that could make that lead obsolete.
Precisely. That's why proposals to cut funding for basic research within the defense budget are viewed with such alarm by strategic thinkers. They erode the very source of this long-term generational advantage. It's the seed corn.
Now, let's shift our focus to the high ground space. For decades, it was largely seen as a domain the U.S. owned, a sanctuary for critical military support systems. But the sources are crystal clear. Space is now a fiercely contested battlefield, and one where the risks are escalating dramatically.
It absolutely is. U.S. military operations across every domain are utterly dependent on space assets. GPS for navigation and precision targeting, satellite communications for command and control, and intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR, satellites for situational awareness and targeting. This profound dependency makes U.S. satellites incredibly tempting, high-value targets for adversaries.
And the U.S. Space Force is responding with a fundamental shift in architecture. Instead of relying on a small number of large, incredibly expensive, exquisite satellites that become critical single points of failure, they're moving towards resilience through proliferation, spreading the risk.
That's the proliferated warfighter space architecture. The core concept is building vast constellations of smaller, cheaper, more numerous, and therefore more replaceable satellites, primarily in low Earth orbit or LEO. The plan to launch over 100 satellites in 2025 alone is a massive step, nearly doubling the size of the on-orbit fleet in a single year.
Doubling in a year.
Yeah. This creates a resilient network, a kind of orbital kill mesh for tracking, communications, and targeting, designed to degrade gracefully and continue functioning even after taking losses from adversary attacks.
And that shift is a direct reaction to the increasingly terrifying counterspace capabilities developed by rivals.
And terrifying they are. Russia has demonstrated a range of anti-satellite, or ASAT, weapons. They possess ground-based jamming and directed energy weapons that can interfere with or blind satellites. They've tested kinetic ASAT missiles. The 2021 test, where they destroyed one of their own defunct satellites, created a massive persistent debris field that poses a long-term threat to virtually everything operating in LEO, including the International Space Station. Junk everywhere.
That test was incredibly reckless.
Reckless is putting it mildly. They also have these unsettling co-orbital satellites, sometimes called nesting dolls, that can approach other satellites and potentially release smaller payloads or maneuver to cause damage. Creepy stuff.
But the most chilling intelligence warnings center on Russia developing a nuclear space-based ASAT weapon.
This is a potential game changer, and not in a good way. This isn't designed to be a precise, targeted strike. A nuclear detonation in space, specifically in LEO, would unleash an electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, and create vast belts of high-energy radiation.
So it fries everything nearby.
This isn't just localized damage. The effects would be widespread, potentially disabling or destroying hundreds, maybe thousands of satellites across large swaths of LEO, regardless of who owns them or what they do. Indiscriminate.
Indiscriminate destruction on an orbital scale is horrifying.
Exactly. China has also successfully tested a kinetic ASAT missile back in 2007, and they are aggressively integrating space-based ISR and weapons capabilities into their broader military planning, aiming to create their own kill mesh, specifically designed to target U.S. assets across multiple domains.
The implications of a potential nuclear detonation in space are just awful. It doesn't just cripple the U.S. military, which is fundamentally reliant on space, but it cripples the global economy. Think about it. Modern finance, navigation, communication networks, agriculture, they are all deeply intertwined with and reliant on satellite systems.
Absolutely. Space has gone from a support domain to a central, incredibly dangerous battleground, and this competition is one of the defining features and risks of the coming years. It's a domain where escalation carries truly catastrophic potential.
And the final technological frontier we need to explore is the digital one: AI, autonomy, and cyber warfare. Everyone's in this game, but the sources point out that the US, China, and Russia are approaching it with fundamentally different doctrines and goals.
That's a crucial distinction. The U.S. approach is largely centered on human autonomy teaming, or H8T. The goal isn't to replace the human warfighter, but to empower them. AI partners are being developed to manage data overload, analyze complex situations faster than humans can, and present options, thereby reducing cognitive load and dramatically speeding up the decision cycle. This is the core philosophy behind the J80C2 vision we mentioned earlier, linking everything to achieve decision dominance.
You see it in programs like the Army Research Lab's work on HAT and AM, artificial intelligence for maneuver and mobility, developing robots that can understand natural language commands and navigate complex off-road terrain autonomously. And the focus on assured autonomy, which is about building systems that are not just capable, but trustworthy and safe under novel conditions. Can we trust the AI?
A critical question. U.S. Cyber Command is also embedding offensive and defensive cyber operations directly into military units and planning, like integrated special operations teams. Cyber capabilities are seen not just as a separate domain, but as a tool to be used in conjunction with kinetic forces.
China's approach is different. They call it intelligentized warfare, viewing AI as the key revolution that will redefine military power. But their national strategy has a unique and frankly chilling focus: AI-driven cognitive warfare.
This goes way beyond traditional hacking or using AI on the battlefield. Cognitive warfare, as the PLA defines it, is about leveraging big data, AI analysis, and automated disinformation campaigns to manipulate an adversary's perceptions, erode their will to fight, degrade their decision-making abilities, and control the information space before and during any kinetic conflict.
It's psychological warfare on steroids.
It's psychological warfare, propaganda, and information operations weaponized and scaled by AI. It's deeply insidious. Using AI not just to break systems, but to break down an adversary's society and their ability to think clearly and make decisions.
Shaping the narrative.
Exactly, sowing chaos and division within a target country, making political consensus impossible. China's heavy investment in related areas like quantum technology for things like ultra-sensitive sensing for submarines or potentially unhackable communications also reflects this top-down, control-oriented approach to the digital domain.
Russia, meanwhile, seems more pragmatic, more focused on tactical adaptation, forged in the crucible of Ukraine.
Less grand theory, more immediate battlefield utility. They're integrating AI and machine learning into drones, particularly cheap FPV first-person view drones, using basic computer vision for navigation and targeting even when GPS is jammed.
Using what works now.
Right. Though it's worth noting, they're heavily reliant on Chinese commercial components to do this. They're also developing counter-drone technologies like electronic warfare systems and even vehicle-mounted lasers.
So it's not just a race for the most powerful algorithms. It's a fundamental clash of doctrines in this digital space. The American vision of human empowerment and decision speed versus China's focus on AI-driven cognitive control and information dominance versus Russia's more tactical battlefield lethality approach.
Understanding these different philosophies is absolutely crucial for predicting how future conflicts in this domain might play out. It's a battle not just for data, but for minds and decisions.
This naturally leads us to what the analysis calls the architecture of subliminal control. This isn't direct kinetic force, but a pervasive influence that shapes the global environment, often beneath the surface.
Think of it as power that operates without punching. It's built on the foundation of hard military power and economic might, but its effects are often non-kinetic, shaping the environment to favor U.S. interests. And the most tangible manifestation of this is the U.S. global footprint.
A network absolutely without peer in human history. We're talking about roughly 750 overseas military base sites in over 80 countries and territories.
750.
Yeah. That accounts for somewhere between 75% and 85% of all foreign military bases on the planet. To put that in perspective, China has maybe 10 such sites outside its immediate neighborhood.
It's historically unprecedented. Major hubs like Ramstein Air Base in Germany, Camp Humphreys in South Korea, one of the largest overseas bases in Japan, Italy, the UK, across the Persian Gulf. This extensive forward posture means U.S. forces aren't just at home. They can be practically anywhere on the planet in a matter of hours when a crisis erupts.
And it's far more than just stationing over 170,000 deployed personnel. These bases are critical nodes for logistics, intelligence gathering, training exercises, and rapid crisis response. They are a fundamental bedrock of deterrence, constantly signaling presence, reassuring allies, and complicating any adversary's calculus by presenting immediate forward-deployed obstacles.
And NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is the premier example of how this global footprint is integrated into a system of influence through alliances. Formed in 1949, it was the U.S.'s first peacetime military alliance and remains its most powerful. Its keystone, Article 5, states that an attack on one member is considered an attack on all, permanently tying the security of North America to that of Europe.
It's a massive force multiplier, not just militarily, but politically. It promotes shared democratic values, provides an essential framework for consultation on security issues, and crucially, drives interoperability, standardizing equipment, aligning defense industries, ensuring military structures can operate together seamlessly in joint exercises and actual operations. They speak the same language, militarily.
Pretty much. This network of bases and alliances creates that ambient control. The constant presence forces potential adversaries to operate under persistent surveillance and within constraints imposed by the U.S.-led system. The deep institutional integration through alliances subtly, but powerfully, aligns partner nations with U.S. strategic interests and norms. This architecture isn't merely preparing for war, it is actively shaping the international security environment every single day.
Hand in hand with that military presence is economic statecraft. The U.S. leverages its central position in the global financial system as a powerful weapon, capable of rewarding friends and punishing adversaries.
It's a damn versatile toolkit. On the coercive side, you have negative sanctions.
Right.
Leveraging the dominance of the U.S. dollar and its central role in global finance allows the U.S. Treasury to restrict or prohibit economic activity for individuals, companies, or even entire countries.
The power of the dollar.
Absolutely. We've seen this used extensively against Iran, against Russia following the Ukraine invasion, against North Korea. Export controls are another powerful tool here, preventing adversaries from acquiring sensitive technologies critical for their military modernization or economic development.
And on the other side, the inducement tools, the positive sanctions, the carrots.
Exactly. Foreign aid channeled through organizations like USAID, development loans, preferential trade deals, military assistance. The Marshall Plan after World War II remains the absolute classic example of using economic power to rebuild allies and counter the influence of a rival power structure.
But China has rolled out its own colossal countermodel, the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI.
A huge one. This is a grand strategy of economic statecraft, a massive global infrastructure program spanning nearly 140 countries, with estimated investments hitting $1.3 trillion by 2027.
Beijing pitches it as mutually beneficial win-win economic cooperation, focused purely on development. But the analysis is clear. It has profound geostrategic and military implications.
Absolutely. These projects create deep economic dependencies on China. Critics often highlight what they call debt trap diplomacy, where countries, often poor or developing nations, take on massive loans they struggle to repay, putting them under pressure to make strategic concessions to Beijing.
Like the Sri Lanka port.
The classic example cited is Sri Lanka, which, after defaulting on payments for the Hambantota port, was forced to lease the port and 15,000 acres of surrounding land to a Chinese state-owned enterprise for 99 years. That's gaining strategic real estate through economic leverage.
And many of these projects have significant dual-use potential. New ports, railways, airports, digital networks built ostensibly for commerce can also support the logistics and operational needs of the PLA Navy as it expands its global reach, creating a network of potential strategic strongpoints for Chinese forces. Bases, essentially.
Potential bases, logistical hubs, yeah. This is essentially a global competition between two rival operating systems for the 21st century. The U.S. system is based on access to its massive market and dollar dominance, upheld by a rules-based order enforced by the potential threat of financial exclusion and sanctions. China's BRI model offers state-directed infrastructure loans and investment, often with fewer upfront political demands than Western lenders, but creating debt, dependency, and strategic leverage over time.
A different kind of control.
Developing nations are facing this choice, and every BRI project pulls a country deeper into China's orbit, potentially reducing U.S. influence and helping to build a new global architecture shaped by Beijing's interests. It's a slow-burn competition.
The final layer of this subliminal control architecture operates in the realm of information and perception. It's the power of attraction, manipulation, and gaining critical intelligence advantage. It's a domain of stark contrast between rivals.
Right. The U.S. traditionally relies on soft power, the ability to influence others through attraction based on its culture, political values, and policies.
Think about it. The global appeal of Hollywood, American music, brands, technology. The magnet of U.S. universities attracting top global talent, often creating elites in other countries who are favorably disposed toward the U.S. Even with its own inconsistencies, the U.S.'s stated values of democracy, human rights, and a free press stand in stark contrast to authoritarian models, offering an aspirational alternative for many.
Contrast that sharply with Russia's reliance on sharp power and outright information warfare. These are manipulative tools used by authoritarian regimes not to persuade through attraction, but to pierce, disrupt, and divide within target societies. The goal isn't to win hearts and minds, but to sow chaos, erode trust in institutions, and make reasoned discourse impossible.
Their ecosystem for this is vast. State-controlled media empires like RT and Sputnik, broadcasting carefully crafted narratives, massive networks of social media bots and troll farms injecting false stories and extremist rhetoric into online discussions, targeting specific divisions within societies. It's industrial scale.
And a truly chilling tactic they've employed is creating information alibis. This involves preemptively spreading false information or alternative narratives designed to deflect blame for actions they plan to commit.
Setting up the excuse beforehand.
Blaming Ukraine for an attack Russia intends to carry out, for instance. It's calculated deception on a strategic level designed to confuse, delay response, and muddy the waters of accountability.
This is part of their broader hybrid warfare approach, combining cyber attacks, sabotage, supporting proxy forces and extremist groups, and clandestine operations to create instability and undermine the social and political fabric of rival nations, particularly democracies which are inherently more open and vulnerable to this kind of manipulation.
Underpinning all of this for the U.S. is its intelligence dominance. The vast U.S. intelligence community, the CIA, FBI, DIA, NSA, and others, provides an unparalleled information advantage. This allows the U.S. to anticipate threats, understand adversary intentions in depth, and conduct covert operations globally. Historical examples like the Berlin Tunnel operation, the U-2 reconnaissance flights, or the decade-long hunt for Osama bin Laden illustrate a global reach and capability that no other nation truly rivals.
So there's a fundamental asymmetry here in the information space. Open, democratic societies that enable U.S. soft power are simultaneously inherently more vulnerable to the manipulative tactics of sharp power and information warfare.
Exactly. U.S. soft power is a powerful long-term asset, but it's vulnerable to short-term disruption and erosion of trust from sophisticated influence campaigns. Countering this requires more than just broadcasting facts. It requires building societal resilience against manipulation. It's about building digital and cognitive immunity within populations.
This all converges on the shifting balance of power, which the sources describe not just as a multipolar world, but specifically multipolarization. It's a process defined by two trends: the diffusion of power to more state and non-state actors, and increasing polarization between major powers with fundamentally incompatible visions for the global order.
Right. The U.S. is still the top player, but it's definitely not the only pole anymore.
Great power competition is the defining feature of this era. China is presented as a true peer competitor across virtually all domains: economic, diplomatic, military, technological, and ideological. They possess the power and the stated ambition to fundamentally reshape the international order.
And Russia, while not a peer economically or technologically, is highlighted as a revanchist power, willing to use military force and hybrid warfare aggressively to challenge the U.S.-led security order in Europe and elsewhere, seeking to reclaim perceived lost influence. They're playing spoiler, effectively.
And complicating this picture are emerging middle powers. Countries like India, Brazil, Turkey, the Gulf states, South Africa. They're increasingly pursuing independent foreign policies, engaging in selective partnerships based on their own interests, rather than automatically aligning with the U.S. or China.
Creates a much messier picture.
It creates a more complex, fragmented, and less predictable global landscape, where the U.S. can't simply dictate terms unilaterally. Its ability to assemble broad coalitions or enforce global norms is increasingly challenged.
And perhaps most critically, the analysis turns a harsh, self-critical lens inward, suggesting that some of the most profound challenges to U.S. supremacy aren't just external, but internal.
The strains of supremacy itself. There's sharp criticism that the U.S. suffers from strategic overstretch and a tendency towards misapplying military force. The argument is that it struggles to distinguish vital interests from peripheral ones, often defaulting to military solutions for problems that are fundamentally political, economic, or social.
Right. An undisciplined impulse to get involved in brushfire wars and stabilization missions in chaotic, impoverished, and ungoverned spaces, like the lengthy, costly, and ultimately inconclusive interventions in Iraq and Afghanistan.
The military is an incredibly powerful hammer, but not every damn problem is a nail that can be solved with kinetic force. These protracted, often ill-defined missions have come at immense cost in lives and treasure, draining resources and largely failing to achieve stable, lasting objectives.
And that directly contributes to the erosion of the force itself and, crucially, that industrial base we discussed. The analysis points to a dangerous say-do gap. U.S. national defense strategy talks about being able to deter or fight in up to 3 theaters simultaneously: the Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. But the active duty force is effectively sized for 1 major conflict, or perhaps 2 smaller ones.
1 war, but planning for 3. That doesn't add up.
No, it doesn't. The active duty Army is the smallest it's been since before World War II. The Navy is struggling to grow, remaining stagnant at under 300 deployable ships, roughly half the size it was at the end of the Cold War. The Air Force's inventory continues to shrink as they retire older aircraft faster than they buy new ones.
So smaller, older.
This results in a smaller, older, and less ready force than strategic ambitions demand. Combine that with the brittle industrial base, unable to surge production or sustain attrition losses, and you have a serious vulnerability that astute adversaries will seek to exploit.
And underpinning all of this is the sheer burden of the costs, and critically, the eroding public will at home. That nearly $1 trillion defense budget, the benefits it provides, maintaining global trade routes, deterring major wars, are diffuse and often hard for the average American to see or appreciate directly.
But the costs are felt directly. Through taxes, through investment opportunities foregone in domestic priorities, and most viscerally, through American lives lost in long, inconclusive wars.
Those protracted conflicts, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, have undeniably sapped public faith in the judgment of political and military leaders and eroded the willingness of the American public to bear the burdens and costs of global leadership.
Creates an understandable domestic impulse to retreat, to turn inward. You hear it all the time.
And this combination of internal factors, the gap between strategic ambition and force capacity, the hollowed-out industrial base, and the eroding public support for global engagement, is arguably the most significant long-term threat to U.S. supremacy identified in the analysis.
It's a sobering thought. The world's most advanced military on paper faces profound questions about its ability to generate and sustain power in a large-scale, multi-front war against determined, capable adversaries. These aren't just academic concerns, they are real-world vulnerabilities that adversaries are undoubtedly analyzing and integrating into their own strategic planning.
So given this complex and challenging assessment, what are the key strategic recommendations that emerge from the analysis? What's the path forward, supposedly?
Well, first and foremost, an urgent call to rebuild the arsenal of democracy. This means fundamentally revitalizing the defense industrial base. A shift from peacetime efficiency to readiness for great power conflict.
Getting serious about production.
Exactly. That involves building truly resilient supply chains, massively expanding munition production lines, not just shells, but missiles, drones, precision weapons, and accelerating the construction of critical platforms like submarines and aircraft, urgently.
Yes.
Second, a hard look at aligning strategic ambition with capacity. Close that dangerous gap between committing to deter or fight in 3 theaters and having a force structure sized for only one major war. This requires sustained, real budgetary growth, not just keeping pace with inflation, to expand the Navy and Air Force inventories, modernize the Army and Marines, and ensure the force is truly ready for high-intensity combat. More money, basically, but spent smarter.
Third, double down relentlessly on asymmetric advantages. That means heavily funding DARPA's high-risk, high-reward R&D model to ensure the U.S. maintains a generational lead in crucial emerging technologies like AI, quantum computing, biotechnology, and autonomy.
Keep that innovation moat deep and wide. It's absolutely crucial if you can't outproduce your rivals in sheer numbers.
Fourth, strengthen alliances and partnerships. They are more critical than ever in a multipolar world where unilateral action is less effective.
Right. This means not just maintaining, but deepening relationships, strengthening NATO, building stronger security architectures in the Indo-Pacific, and cultivating flexible coalitions with those emerging middle powers to counter rivals and uphold the rules-based international order. Need friends.
And
finally, develop real resilience in the contested domains of space and cyber. Accelerate that transition to a proliferated, resilient space architecture that can withstand attack. Bolster cyber defenses across civilian and military networks. And critically, develop clear doctrines and response options, working closely with allies to deter the most destabilizing uses of space and cyber weapons, like that nuclear ASAT threat. Figure out the red lines.
So when we look at all of this, what does it ultimately mean for U.S. military power in 2025? The core tension is stark and unavoidable. The U.S. military is undeniably the most powerful, technologically advanced force on the planet, yet it faces profound, even existential challenges from determined rivals who are often configured for a fundamentally different kind of fight, with kinetic and non-kinetic.
Its dominance is significant, certainly, but it is also undeniably fragile.
The overarching takeaway is that preserving this advantage isn't a matter of resting on past laurels or relying on a single miracle weapon system. It requires a clear-eyed, damn hard look at the internal contradictions and vulnerabilities, the industrial base, the force size, the political will, just as much as it requires countering external threats.
Yeah, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, this competition isn't just about military hardware or budgets. It's a fundamental struggle over the very shape of the future international order. The U.S. military and the architecture of influence built around it isn't just defending platforms, it's defending the system of alliances, partnerships, and norms that has largely underpinned global stability and prosperity for decades. It's defending the whole system.
This raises an important question for you to consider, one that sits at the heart of this complex picture. In a world where sheer industrial might and the ability to rapidly churn out basic war material are making a brutal, bloody comeback.
And where technology like AI-driven cognitive warfare is actively aiming to manipulate truth and degrade your ability to make decisions.
Can the U.S. truly maintain its edge with its current strategic approach? What does strength even mean anymore when your adversary can build 200 ships for every one of yours, or potentially disable your global communications and navigation from orbit?